Hello Year 10s, welcome to the marking video for the food chains exam. Make sure you have your blue pen to write your notes handy and also your green pen to mark your exam. So here we have a food chain of a river, and the first thing I have done when I see a food chain is write in my keywords. So at the front I have the producer, and remember producers are usually plants. In this case, we have algae, so a very small microscopic plant. We have the primary consumer, we have the secondary consumer, and we have the tertiary consumer. Now, don't get confused, because the primary consumer, although it's in it's called primary, it's actually in the second position. So don't get confused with that. In our first question, we had to draw a line from each scientific term to the correct organism. Well, here we are. Now, one thing to note, an apex predator, you might have not heard of that, but apex means that it's top of the food chain. So in this case, the one that's top of the food chain is the large fish, which is why we've drawn a line to the large fish. The primary consumer is usually in the second position here, and that's why we've linked to invertebrate animals. And finally, the producer, usually in the first position, is our algae. It's worth 2 marks, so you need to get all 3 lines correct to get 2 marks, 2 lines correct to get 1 mark, and if you get any less than 2 lines, you get no marks. Here we have a biomass of organisms at each stage of the food chain, and we have to calculate the percentage of biomass of the invertebrate animals that live and transfer to the large fish. So we have to use this equation. And we're looking for large fish, which is here, and we're looking for the invertebrate animals, which is here. So we just substitute in 10 divided by 200 times by 100, and that is 5% to get the 2 marks there. Next question. We have a disease kills many of the small fish. Why does the number of the invertebrate animals increase? Well, if the small fish die out, well then there are less predators eating the invertebrate animals, and therefore they will increase. So why does the number increase? There are fewer small fish eating the invertebrate animals. Next question. Copepods are tiny animals that live in the sea, and here we've written during the day they live deep down in the seabed. So I've written a little note to remind myself that during the day they're found deep down. In the night, they move up to the top to feed on tiny plants. When the sun rises, they move down to the bottom again. So what we could do is add a food chain here that we have plants, we have copepods, and we've got herring. So you're thinking to yourself, why are they going to need the tiny plants? So the tiny plants why do they live near the surface of the sea? Well, plants need light, and as we know, they need light to be able to photosynthesize. And to remind you, I've written in the equation here, carbon dioxide plus water changes into glucose plus oxygen. This is such an important equation that you need to remember. So the key thing is, though, on top of our equation, of our arrow, we write light, because it's important that we have it to catalyze this process. The herring, which is this fish here, will eat on the copepods. Where will they be found during the day? Well, here again, let's refer back to my notes. During the day, they're found deep down, the copepods. So therefore, herring are also going to be found deep down. Why? To feed on the copepods. Below we have a food web. So if we look at our food web here, now one thing to note, a food web is made up of lots of food chains. So one that I've highlighted out here is a food chain that we have here. So we have a pondweed to hog lice to diving beetles. That is one food chain. Another food chain would be plant debris to water boatmen to diving beetles. That's another food chain. A food web is made up of lots of food chains, and we can see how they are linked. So we can see that both the snails are eaten by loaches and the caddis larvae. So we can use this food web to show how they all affect each other. So we need to name one secondary consumer in the food web. But as I said, producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer is always in the 3rd position after 2 arrows. So you can see here, pondweed to hog lice is 1 arrow, another arrow, diving beetles, that will be a secondary consumer. Another secondary consumer, pondweed to hog lice, the producer, prime consumer, secondary consumer, caddis larvae. Algae, mussels, mites, that'll be a secondary consumer. Algae, water fleas, mussels, another secondary consumer. So after 2 arrows, so you could have had any of these organisms up here. Next, the algae are small green plants. Give 3 conditions needed for plants to produce sugars. Now, another word that we have for sugar is glucose. In other words, conditions for photosynthesis to happen. And we have here 4 conditions here. You have carbon dioxide concentration, light intensity, water, and chlorophyll. Any of these 3 of the 4 can get even marked. We have a pyramid of biomass of organisms in an aquarium. So here is our pyramid of biomass, and as you can see, at every level biomass is lost, because if biomass wasn't lost, this bottom block of the pyramid would be the same size for the tertiary consumers, but biomass is lost at every stage. And it's really important to know that biomass will always be lost at every stage. So why does this happen? Well, firstly, not all of the matter is eaten by organisms. For example, bones and shells aren't eaten. This is for an aquarium. If you were given another example, you could say, for example, fur of animals aren't eaten as well. Biomass is also lost through feces and urine. This is what we call excretion. Feces is another word for poo, urine another word for pee, but we would use the scientific terms, and we have excretion here. Also, biomass is lost through carbon dioxide and water vapor. These are both respiration products. When an animal respires, they will release carbon dioxide and water vapor, hence why biomass is always lost. In fact, only about 10% of biomass is transferred to each stage. 90% is actually used by the animals to try and compete life processes such as respiration, such as excretion. Okay, moving on to question 4, we have a picture of a bull here, and we can see this bull, it has 3,050 kilojoules of energy eaten. So this is what goes into the bull. We have 125 kilojoules used for new growth. Now this is what will be passed on to the next level of the food chain. So if we have another animal, usually maybe it's a human, this is what's available to the human because it's eaten by the human. So that is the energy available to the humans. We have 1,905 kilojoules lost through feces, another word in excretion. And finally we have 1,020 kilojoules, and this probably could be for respiration, as we said before. So it says here, using this information in the diagram suggests why food chains are usually very short. Well, if you look at how much is only used for growth passed on to the next organism, it's not a lot. In fact, if you calculate it, so we can do 125 divided by 3,050 times by 100, it works out, I think, to be only about 4%. So only 4% is passed to the humans. And remember, the humans aren't eating it all either. We don't eat the bones of a cow. We don't eat the fur or the hind of the cow. So only 4% is passed on. So the first answer is little energy is used for growth. As you can see, more specifically, it's only 125 kilojoules. Most energy is wasted through respiration and excretion. And finally, it's repeated at each level, so there's less energy at every stage. As I said, there's only 4% given to us. I know there's no one that eats humans, but at each stage of the food chain, there'll just be less and less energy. Next, many animals which form our diet are herbivores rather than carnivores. Herbivores meaning they only, and this is a key word here, only eat vegetables or plants. Where we have carnivores, this is only eats meat. So we have to explain why as fully as you can. Well, the first thing is plants always start the food chain. So therefore, the primary consumer, so in the second position, is always going to either be a herbivore or an omnivore. It's not going to be a carnivore. Secondly, we now have shorter food chains. And lastly, less energy is lost. Those are the three answers there to get the 3 marks. We move on to the next question. Here, students investigated this food chain in the garden. And as I said before, you want to just keep practicing writing your consumer, secondary consumer, your keywords here, just to remind yourself. You can even add predator and prey as well. So the students estimated the number of lettuce plants in the garden. Keyword here is estimate. They are using an educated guess by estimating. So estimated the number of snails feeding on the lettuces, and then they counted 2 thrushes in the garden in 5 hours. So our next question says, here's a table of their calculations. Give 2 ways biomass is lost along the food chain. Well, it's the same as before. We could have had bones and shells aren't eaten. Biomass is lost through feces, urine, carbon dioxide and water. So there are any of those 2 ways there. Scientists estimate about 90% of the biomass in food is lost at each step. As I said before, only 10% is passed on to the next organism. So only 10% passed to next organism in the food chain. Suggest one reason why the students' value for the percentage of biomass lost between snails and thrushes is only 66%. So we can see here it's only 60%, 66. We expect it to be 90, but it's only 66. So why isn't that much biomass lost from snails? Well, there's several reasons. Firstly, thrushes can eat other things. They might not just eat snails. Secondly, this is only an estimation of population size. As I said before, it's only an estimation. We have 2 types of snails we're looking at now. So we have 2 different colours, light or dark, with stripes and no stripes. So there's 2 factors we're looking at. We're looking at, firstly, what colour they are, and secondly, if they have stripes. So here's a picture of a dark coloured snail with stripes. Here is a light coloured snail, no stripes. So next they've done a survey from the woodlands and grasslands, and we have a graph to show this data. So here is our graph here. It's quite tricky to understand and take in, but we can use our key to help us. So what we can see is that mainly in the woodlands, you find snails that have a high percentage of no stripes and a low percentage of being light coloured. Whereas if we look at in the grassland, we have a high percentage of snails that are light coloured, and they have, because it's no stripes, they do have stripes. But firstly, the question is here, why is a scatter graph using this data? Well, we're using a scatter graph to show a pattern. We're trying to find a pattern where to see if the snails have stripes and if they're light coloured. So why is the scatter graph used for data? There are also 2 dependent variables. Dependent meaning things that we are measuring. We're not changing anything. So there are no independent variables. We are measuring whether they have stripes or not, and measuring whether they are light coloured. We have to compare the appearance, those that live in the woodlands compared to those that live in the grasslands. So we can see in the woodlands, I've focused on the dark dots here. They have darker coloured shells because they have a low percentage of light shells. So this is mainly of a darker colour. If we look across this way. Then if we look at the x-axis, they have fewer stripes. They have a high percentage of no stripes. You could say the converse. You could talk about the grassland animals as well. You could say that they are mainly light coloured and there are more stripes. You could choose that. And our final question is, we had to suggest a reason why they live in the woodlands. Why are they going to be dark colours? Why are they going to have no stripes? Well, very simply is that they can camouflage from predators. And this is the end of the marking video, so make sure you count up your marks and give yourself a mark out of 30.